Kyla Johnson's fingers fumbled with her keys as she rushed down the steps of her apartment building. She was late for her shift at the grocery store, and the wind biting at her skin only made her feel more frazzled. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another reminder of the pressure she was under to juggle school and work. "Just a quick coffee," she muttered to herself, as she spotted the small coffee shop down the street. She could already taste the warmth of the latte she craved. A little caffeine might help her settle her nerves before facing another long day at the store. She pushed open the door of the coffee shop, and as soon as she stepped inside, the familiar scent of roasted coffee beans and baked goods enveloped her. She took a deep breath, grateful for the brief moment of peace, but that calm shattered as soon as she heard the laughter. A group of bikers, at least 5 of them, were lounging outside, leaning against their motorcycles. Their leather jackets and tattoos screamed intimidation, and their loud voices echoed into the small shop. Kyla hesitated by the door, unsure of whether she should go back to her car or just ignore them and get her coffee. "Hey!" one of them called out, his voice low and mocking. "Look at that. A girl like you, in a place like this." Kyla's heart raced. She didn't know why they were talking to her, but she felt the heat of their eyes on her as she took a step forward. She tried to stay calm, telling herself to just ignore them. But the taunts followed her as she walked past. "Where you really from?" Another voice broke through, sharper now, like a whip. Kyla didn't answer. Her fingers gripped the strap of her purse a little tighter, her palms suddenly sweaty. She wanted to ignore them, but it felt impossible. Their words stung, not just because of their tone, but because of the implication. The suggestion that she didn't belong in the space she was standing in, simply because of the color of her skin. She could feel their eyes on her as she approached the counter, but the barista was busy making drinks and didn't notice. Kyla forced herself to focus on her order, pretending not to hear the group behind her as their laughter grew louder. "Is she really gonna just stand there like she owns the place?" one of them sneered. Kyla clenched her jaw. She wasn't going to let them get to her. Not here, not now. But when she reached for her wallet to pay, the one biker who had spoken earlier stepped forward, blocking her way. He was much taller than her, towering over her as if to assert his dominance. "Where do you think you're going?" he sneered. Her stomach twisted into knots, and her mind raced. Should she just try to walk out? Was it safe? But the thought of running felt even worse. She wasn't going to let them push her out of this space, no matter how uncomfortable it made her. Kyla took a deep breath. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady, but it didn't sound like her own. She felt like she was already losing the fight, her body trembling with adrenaline. The biker smirked. "What, you too good for us?" he asked, as his friends snickered behind him. "Don't act like you belong here, sweetheart." Kyla's eyes flicked toward the door, calculating whether she could make it out of the shop without confrontation. But she knew deep down that wouldn't stop them from following her, or worse, escalating things in public. She reached for her phone instead. The screen lit up with a message from her mother reminding her to stay strong, but it was the name she saw next that brought a sense of calm. Marcus Williams, the family friend who had always been there when things got tough. She quickly dialed his number, her fingers trembling as she pressed the screen. The bikers were still taunting her, but she had no intention of backing down now. "Marcus, I need your help," she said when he picked up. Her voice was shaky, but there was determination there, too. "There are some bikers outside the coffee shop. They're threatening me, and I don't know what to do." Marcus's voice was calm, reassuring. "Stay right where you are, Kyla. Don't let them intimidate you. I'm on my way." As Kyla hung up, a sense of power surged within her. She wasn't alone. She didn't have to face this by herself. The bikers might have thought they could push her around, but they had no idea who she knew. And soon, they would learn that she wasn't the type of girl to back down. Where are you watching from? Please publicly comment your opinion to let us know. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Kyla stood by the counter, her heart pounding as she waited for Marcus to arrive. The bikers were still laughing, still throwing jabs in her direction, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. The way they looked at her, like she was less than them, only fueled her resolve. They were expecting her to shrink, to let them have their fun at her expense. But this time, she wouldn't be their target. One of the bikers, the one who had blocked her earlier, swaggered up to her again, his face a few inches from hers. "You think you're tough, huh?" he growled, his breath hot against her face. "I'm getting real tired of you acting like you belong here." Kyla met his gaze, her chest tight with fear, but her mind clear. She wasn't going to let this escalate. Not here, not today. The biker's face loomed inches from Kyla's, his cold, menacing eyes locking onto hers. The stench of cigarettes and leather lingered in the air as he sneered at her, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. His grip on the handlebars of his motorcycle tightened, and the other bikers behind him watched with amusement, waiting for her to flinch. "You really think you're too good for us, don't you?" he spat. His words were a low growl, meant to make her shrink in fear. But Kyla held her ground, staring back at him with unwavering defiance. Her breath caught in her throat as the adrenaline hit her bloodstream, but she kept her voice steady. "No, I think you're too full of yourself to realize you're wasting your time." The biker raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her response. The taunting laughter from his friends slowly died down, replaced by a silence that made the tension even more palpable. For a moment, Kyla wondered if she had said the wrong thing, but she knew it was too late to back down now. He leaned in closer, his breath hot and rancid against her cheek. "You sure you want to keep talking like that?" he hissed, his voice dangerous. "You wouldn't want things to get ugly, would you?" Kyla didn't back down. She couldn't. If she showed even an ounce of fear, they'd think they had the upper hand. "I've dealt with worse than you," she said, though her voice was quieter this time, the weight of the situation starting to sink in. She wasn't sure what worse meant exactly, but she wasn't going to let this man intimidate her into submission. But before the biker could respond, the sound of a car engine roaring down the street interrupted the standoff. Kyla's heart leaped into her chest as she recognized the sleek, black SUV. She didn't even need to look to know who was inside. Marcus. The SUV came to a screeching halt in front of the coffee shop, and the doors flung open. Marcus, dressed in his usual dark suit and tie, stepped out, exuding authority with every stride. His tall, broad frame cast a shadow over the bikers as he approached. His eyes locked onto Kyla's, filled with concern but also a fierce protectiveness that made her feel like she wasn't alone anymore. The bikers paused. They hadn't expected this. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus's voice was calm, but the edge of command in his tone sent a shiver down Kyla's spine. He stood tall, hands tucked into his pockets, like he didn't have a care in the world. But the bikers could sense the danger in his presence, and for a split second, the atmosphere shifted. The biker in front of Kyla slowly took a step back, sizing up Marcus. He didn't like being challenged. "You think you can just roll up here and scare us off?" he spat. Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not here to scare anyone, but I'm sure as hell not going to let you make my friend feel unsafe." The tension thickened. The bikers exchanged wary glances, unsure of how to proceed. They could tell that Marcus wasn't just some random guy. There was something about him, a quiet confidence that made them rethink their next move. One of the other bikers, a woman with piercings in her nose and lip, snorted. "What's a suit like you gonna do? You gonna call the cops?" Marcus didn't even blink. "No need. I'm more than capable of handling things myself." Kyla could see the wheels turning in the bikers' heads, and she knew they were weighing their options. They hadn't expected Marcus to show up, and now they were starting to realize that picking on her might not be as easy as they thought. She could feel the power of his presence, the reassurance that she wasn't alone. But the bikers weren't backing down just yet. The tall biker who had been in her face turned to Marcus, his tone shifting to something more aggressive. "We don't take kindly to people who think they can just step in, you know? Maybe you should just keep your little friend here out of our business." Marcus stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the man's. The distance between them closed until they were standing toe-to-toe. Kyla's heart raced in her chest. She knew Marcus was trying to defuse the situation without escalating it further, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "We're done here," Marcus said, his voice ice-cold. "You've made your point, but if you want to continue causing trouble, I'll make sure you regret it." The bikers hesitated, clearly sensing that Marcus wasn't someone they wanted to mess with. After a long, tense silence, the biker who had been leading the harassment stepped back, his face a mix of anger and uncertainty. Whatever, he muttered. You got lucky, old man. With that, the group began to move toward their bikes. The woman with piercings shot one last glare at Kyla before getting on her motorcycle. The others followed suit, revving their engines one by one. Kyla's breath escaped her in a shaky sigh as they pulled away, leaving the parking lot in a cloud of exhaust and noise. Her body was still tense, but the immediate threat was gone. The air around her felt a little lighter, but her pulse still raced from the encounter. Marcus turned to her, his expression softening. You all right? He asked, his voice warm and reassuring. Kyla nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. She hadn't realized how much she needed his presence until he arrived. Yeah, thanks for showing up. Marcus smiled, though his eyes still held a flicker of concern. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you're not in control, Kyla. You're stronger than that. And next time, you call me earlier. Kyla smiled back, feeling a renewed sense of confidence. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance anymore. She had allies, and she wasn't afraid to stand her ground. As Marcus walked back toward his car, Kyla's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her mom. Be strong, baby. You've got this. Kyla looked out at the road where the bikers had just disappeared. She had stood her ground today, but she knew this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to push her down. But she wasn't scared anymore. No matter what came next, she was ready. The dust had barely settled when Kyla's phone rang again. It wasn't Marcus this time. The moment Kyla entered her apartment that evening, she could still feel the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her hand trembled slightly as she locked the door behind her, the weight of the day sinking in. The biker incident had left her shaken, but more than that, it had awakened something in her, something fierce and unyielding. She took a deep breath and reached for her phone. There was a message from her best friend, Jasmine. I saw what happened at the coffee shop. You good? Kyla swallowed hard. She had tried to brush it off, but seeing the text brought the whole situation back to the forefront of her mind. She hadn't had a chance to tell Jasmine everything yet. No one had truly known the gravity of the situation until now. She tapped out a quick reply. Yeah, I'm good. Marcus showed up. Everything's fine now. The phone buzzed again almost immediately. Jasmine's response came with a string of exclamation points. Marcus? The Marcus? Oh my God, Kyla. You gotta tell me everything. Kyla smiled softly, her heart lightening at the thought of her friend's excitement. She hadn't even told her about Marcus's role in the business world, or how he always seemed to be a step ahead of everyone else. There was no way she could explain it in a text. She was about to send another reply when the phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. Her stomach dropped, and her instincts told her this wasn't going to be good. She hesitated, then answered the call. Hello? There was a brief silence before a cold, low voice replied, sending a chill through her. You think you can just walk around here, acting like you're untouchable? Like you're better than us? The voice sneered. It was the same biker from earlier, the one who had been in her face. You and that fancy suit guy, don't think this is over. Kyla felt her throat tighten, but she refused to back down. What do you want? She demanded, her voice steady despite the rising fear in her chest. You'll see soon enough, the biker said, the menace in his voice clear. Don't think you're safe just because he showed up. You've got a target on your back now, and you can't hide from us. The line went dead with an abrupt click. Kyla stood there, frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. She had expected the bikers to be a threat, but this was more than just a one-time encounter. This was a declaration of war. The reality hit her hard. She wasn't just dealing with a group of people who were willing to intimidate her for sport. They were dangerous, and now they were making it personal. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead as the fear began to creep in. She needed to talk to Marcus. Kyla grabbed her coat, her heart racing as she dialed his number. The phone rang twice before he picked up. Kyla. His voice was calm, but she could hear the faint worry in it. What's going on? I got a call, she said, her voice shaky despite her best efforts to sound composed. It was one of the bikers. They said it's not over, that I've got a target on my back now. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. She could practically hear the wheels turning in his head. You did the right thing by calling me, Marcus said, his tone firm. But you need to be careful. I don't know what they're planning, but I'm not going to let them get away with this. Kyla bit her lip, feeling a mix of relief and fear. Marcus was there, but she knew things were only going to escalate from here. She couldn't stay in her apartment, not with the threat hanging over her head. I don't know what to do, she admitted quietly. You don't have to figure this out alone, Marcus replied, his voice softer now. I'll help you. Stay where you are for now. I'll send someone to watch your place tonight. We'll figure this out, Kyla. Trust me. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kyla felt a small flicker of hope. Marcus wasn't just offering his help. He was making it clear he would do whatever it took to protect her. Thank you, she whispered, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. I mean it, Kyla. I've got your back. The call ended, and for a moment, she simply stood there, her phone in hand, trying to gather her thoughts. The bikers weren't going to let this go. They'd made that clear. But now, Kyla wasn't facing them alone. She had Marcus, and he wasn't the type to back down. She sat on the couch, her fingers still trembling as she texted Jasmine back. I need to lay low for a bit. They're not done with me. Within seconds, Jasmine's reply came. I'm here for you. Just let me know if you need anything, okay? Kyla smiled, the comfort of her friend's support easing some of the tension in her chest. But she knew things were about to get a lot harder before they got better. Whatever the bikers were planning, she wasn't backing down. She'd face it head-on, and this time, she wouldn't be alone. The night was restless. Kyla couldn't sleep, tossing and turning on her couch as every creak and groan of the building made her jump. She kept glancing at her phone, waiting for some kind of sign, some reassurance that she wasn't completely alone in this. But nothing came. The night dragged on, heavy with uncertainty. Kyla sat on the couch, her eyes darting to the window every few minutes, scanning the street for any sign of movement. Her phone was silent, and with every passing minute, the fear started to creep in. What were the bikers planning? Why had they singled her out? She had tried to settle her nerves by distracting herself, watching TV, reading, but it was all just background noise to the thoughts running in her head. She couldn't shake the image of the biker's face, the way he'd threatened her. Her chest tightened as the words echoed in her mind. You've got a target on your back now. Kyla stood up, pacing around her small apartment, trying to work off the anxious energy. Every few steps, her hand would drift to her phone, then back to the window. It wasn't just the bikers that scared her. It was the uncertainty. She didn't know how far they were willing to go. She didn't know if Marcus's promise to protect her was enough to keep her safe. Suddenly, the phone vibrated in her hand, snapping her out of her spiral. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Marcus. Stay put. Someone's on the way to watch your place tonight. Don't open the door unless it's me, okay? Kyla exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in her body start to ease just a little. At least she wasn't alone in this anymore. But the fear still lingered. She needed to be strong. She couldn't let the bikers intimidate her. Not when she had so much to lose. Her phone rang. She almost didn't recognize the number. It wasn't Marcus's, but the area code was local. With a deep breath, she answered. Hello? Kyla. The voice on the other end was low and cold. It wasn't the biker from earlier, but the tone was unmistakable. You think you've won? Think again. This is just the beginning. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as the voice continued. You don't belong here. You never will. And we're not going to stop until you're gone. The line went dead. Kyla's heart pounded in her chest. The sense of danger was suffocating. They were getting bolder, more personal. The threats weren't just idle. They were a promise. And she didn't know how much longer she could keep hiding. She walked over to the window, looking out at the street below. Her eyes scanned the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement, but there was nothing except the chill of the night air. Stay put, she reminded herself. Don't do anything stupid. She jumped when she heard a knock at the door. Her heart slammed into her ribcage. She stood frozen for a moment, eyes fixed on the door. It was a soft knock, too soft for anyone from the bikers. It had to be Marcus's contact, the person he'd promised would be watching over her. Taking a steadying breath, she cautiously approached the door. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she peered through the peephole, scanning the hallway. There was a man standing outside, but she couldn't make out much of his face. He was dressed in a dark jacket, his figure blending into the shadows of the hall. "Who is it?" Kyla called through the door, keeping her voice steady but firm. "Marcus sent me," the man replied. His voice was deep, calm. "I'm here to watch over you tonight." Kyla hesitated for only a second before unlocking the door. She cracked it open just enough to see the man's face. He looked ordinary enough, someone she might pass by on the street without giving a second glance. But in this moment, he was a lifeline. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but sincere. The man nodded, stepping back slightly to give her space. "I'll be right outside your door, just in case. Stay inside, keep the door locked. Don't go anywhere." Kyla nodded, but the moment the door closed behind him, the feeling of isolation returned. She wasn't alone anymore, but the fear that gripped her heart wasn't easily shaken. She couldn't stop thinking about what the bikers had said, about how they weren't going to stop until she was gone. She sank onto the couch, staring at her phone again. Another message from Marcus had come through. "Keep your phone close. Don't hesitate to call if you need anything." Kyla felt a knot in her stomach loosen just slightly. She wasn't entirely safe yet, but at least she wasn't facing this alone. She had people who cared about her, people who were willing to fight for her. For now, though, she would have to wait. Wait for whatever came next. Wait for the bikers to make their move. And wait to see if she could stop them before they turned her life upside down. The next morning came too soon. Kyla barely slept. Every creak of the building felt like an approaching threat, and the silence was almost worse than the noise. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about the call from the biker last night. The words rang in her ears, growing louder with every passing hour. She had no choice but to keep moving forward. She couldn't live in fear. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the room. Kyla had barely slept, tossing and turning throughout the night, the constant hum of anxiety buzzing in her veins. She hadn't felt this trapped in a long time. The walls of her apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. As she sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of half-empty coffee, her thoughts swirled with the threat the bikers had made. She couldn't stop replaying the conversation in her head, the cold, menacing voice on the phone, the promise that this was only the beginning. Her stomach twisted into a knot. She needed a plan. She couldn't just sit here waiting for the bikers to make their next move. Her phone vibrated suddenly, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus. "I'll be at your place in 30 minutes. Stay ready." Kyla's heart raced. She had been expecting Marcus, but the urgency of his message made her even more aware of the danger she was in. Something had changed. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the bikers anymore. It was about her survival. She grabbed her jacket, slipping it on as she walked to the door. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't going to just hide in her apartment and wait for the storm to pass. She had to confront it, face whatever was coming head-on. The knock at the door made her jump, though she wasn't sure why. She had been expecting it. She took a deep breath and opened it. Marcus stood there, his eyes scanning the hallway behind him before he stepped inside. "How's it going?" Kyla asked, her voice a little shakier than she'd intended. "Everything's still quiet," Marcus replied, though there was a tension in his voice that Kyla didn't miss. "But that's not good news. They're plotting something. I can feel it." Kyla's stomach dropped at his words. "What should I do?" Marcus looked at her with determination, his gaze steady. "You stay close to me. We're going to find out exactly what these bikers are up to, and we're going to stop them." Kyla nodded, but the pit in her stomach didn't go away. The bikers were dangerous, unpredictable, and violent. She didn't know if Marcus's plan would be enough to stop them, but it was the only option she had. "Come on," Marcus said, heading toward the door. "Let's go." Kyla followed him out into the hall, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. It felt strange to be out in the open, like she was walking into the lion's den. She tried to push the fear down, but it clung to her like a shadow. They walked quickly down the stairs and out into the street, where Marcus led her to his car. As they got in, Marcus glanced at her. "We'll get this sorted," he said, though there was an edge to his voice that made Kyla uneasy. "I'll keep you safe. You just have to trust me." "I do," Kyla said softly, though her mind was racing. The bikers had made it clear they weren't going to back off. She had to be ready for anything. The car started with a low rumble as Marcus drove them toward the outskirts of the city. The quiet tension in the car felt like it was about to crack. Kyla sat up straighter, her hands clenched in her lap, as the city passed by in a blur of gray and steel. "What do you think they're planning?" Kyla finally asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," Marcus said, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "But we're going to find out." They drove in silence for several minutes, until they reached a quiet, industrial part of town, far from the eyes of the public. The streetlights were dimmer here, and the buildings looked abandoned, as if no one had lived or worked there for years. Marcus parked the car behind an old warehouse, and for a moment, Kyla wondered if they had made a mistake coming here. "You stay here," Marcus said, turning to her. "I'll check things out." "No way," Kyla replied, shaking her head. "I'm not staying in the car. I'm not running anymore." Marcus gave her a sharp look, but he knew she was right. "Fine. Stay close and stay quiet. Don't make a sound unless I tell you to." They both got out of the car, Kyla's heart pounding in her chest as they approached the warehouse. The building loomed in front of them, its windows dark and silent. It felt like the calm before a storm, and Kyla wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever was coming next. They moved quickly, keeping low to the ground as they slipped around to the side of the building. Marcus motioned for Kyla to stay behind a large metal dumpster as he crept closer to a window. His eyes flicked back to her, and he nodded for her to follow. Kyla's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, her body tense with fear. She could hear the muffled sounds of voices coming from inside the building, gruff, angry voices. They were close, too close. Marcus motioned for her to stay down as he peeked inside. For a moment, everything was still. Then, Marcus cursed under his breath. "They're getting ready to make their move. We have to stop them before they hurt anyone." Kyla felt her pulse quicken. The time for hiding was over. She wasn't just going to let them push her around anymore. She had to act now. Kyla's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched behind the dumpster, trying to steady her breath. Every part of her screamed to turn and run, to flee before things got worse, but Marcus's presence next to her reminded her of what she had to do. She couldn't back down now. "What's the plan?" she whispered, keeping her voice as low as possible. Marcus didn't answer right away, his eyes fixed on the movement inside the warehouse. Through the small crack in the window, Kyla could make out dark shapes moving around, the sound of muffled voices filling the air. It was clear. This wasn't a random hangout. The bikers were preparing for something big. "We need to get inside," Marcus said quietly, his voice cold. "We can't let them leave this place with whatever they're planning." "We stop them now," Kyla nodded, even though the pit in her stomach only grew heavier with the realization of what they were about to face. "What if we're not enough?" Marcus turned to her, his eyes fierce. "We'll make sure we are. Stick to the plan, and we'll get through this." Kyla swallowed, her nerves burning with anxiety. She didn't know if she was ready for the kind of confrontation Marcus was hinting at, but she couldn't back down. Not now. They moved quickly and silently, ducking behind stacks of crates and debris as they approached the back door of the warehouse. Kyla's mind raced. She was about to face these bikers head-on, and there was no turning back now. The bikers were just inside, oblivious to the danger lurking just outside their door. Marcus pressed his ear to the door. "I don't hear anything. We'll have to make our move now." He slowly turned the handle, and the door creaked open. The moment they stepped inside, the noise hit them. Loud, grating music blared from a speaker in the corner, and the smell of oil and smoke filled the air. Kyla's eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light as they moved deeper into the warehouse, staying close to the shadows. Marcus's eyes scanned the room, and Kyla followed his gaze. There, in the middle of the large open space, stood a group of bikers, their backs turned as they discussed something in low voices. They hadn't noticed them yet. "Stay close," Marcus muttered, his hand brushing the gun tucked into his waistband. Kyla's heart skipped a beat. She had seen Marcus use that gun before, during one of their rougher encounters, but now, in the dimly lit warehouse, it felt like a cold reminder of just how serious things had gotten. The tension in the room was palpable as they moved closer. Kyla's breath caught in her throat when one of the bikers turned around suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he spotted them. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice gruff and demanding. "What the hell are you doing here?" In an instant, everything seemed to fall into chaos. The other bikers turned, their eyes locking onto Marcus and Kyla with the same cold intensity. They were trapped. Marcus didn't hesitate. He drew his gun and aimed it at the biker closest to him. "Step back," he ordered, his voice steady but dangerous. The room fell into tense silence as the bikers considered their options. Some shifted nervously, while others reached for weapons of their own, but none of them moved toward Marcus or Kyla. "You think you can stop us?" one of the bikers sneered, his hands slowly rising in mock surrender. "This is our turf. You're out of your league." Kyla didn't wait for Marcus to respond. The fear that had been boiling in her chest exploded, and she stepped forward. "No," she said, her voice trembling with both anger and defiance. "This isn't your turf anymore. You're not going to hurt anyone else." The biker's eyes flicked to her, then back to Marcus, clearly sizing up the situation. The room was tense, the air thick with the threat of violence. But Marcus held steady, his gun unwavering. "We don't want trouble," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "We just want answers." The lead biker chuckled darkly. "You think we're just going to hand over answers to a couple of wannabe heroes?" Kyla stepped even closer, her fists clenched at her sides. "You've been bullying people for too long. It ends now." One of the other bikers laughed, but it was a hollow, nervous sound. They were no longer sure how this was going to play out. Kyla could see the doubt creeping into their expressions, the realization that they might be facing more than they had bargained for. The lead biker didn't like that. "You think you can just walk in here and take over? You don't know who you're messing with." Kyla wasn't scared anymore. The weight of everything she'd been through had built up inside her, and now, for the first time, she wasn't backing down. "I don't care who you are. It's over. No more threats. No more fear." A tense silence fell over the room. Marcus held his gun steady, his eyes locked on the leader, while Kyla felt the power of her words settle in the air between them. And then, the unexpected happened. The lead biker stepped back, his face hardening, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "We're done," he muttered, as if he had made a decision in that moment. He looked at his crew, a silent signal passing between them. Slowly, one by one, the bikers dropped their weapons, their stance shifting from aggression to reluctant surrender. Kyla felt the weight lift from her chest, but only slightly. They had won this round, but the battle wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. "We'll leave," the lead biker growled, his voice low and filled with anger. "But this isn't over. You haven't heard the last of us." Kyla didn't flinch. She knew this wasn't the end. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had regained some control over her life. "We'll be ready," she said. The bikers turned and left, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Kyla and Marcus standing in the silence of the warehouse. Marcus finally lowered his gun. "That's how it's done," he said quietly. But Kyla wasn't sure if she could believe that. She wasn't sure how much longer they could keep this fight going. Kyla and Marcus stood in the warehouse, the silence stretching out around them, almost too heavy to bear. The bikers were gone, but the tension in the air felt like a storm waiting to break. Kyla wiped her forehead, the adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through her veins. "That was close," she muttered, her voice shaky as she lowered her hands. Marcus nodded, but his eyes remained focused on the door the bikers had exited through. "They won't forget this," he said grimly, "but at least we've bought ourselves some time." Kyla turned toward him, her mind still racing. "What happens now? Are we just supposed to wait for them to come back?" Marcus finally met her gaze, his expression hardening. "We don't wait. We keep moving. We keep making noise so they know we're not backing down." Kyla took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. "You're right. But what if they bring more people? What if this whole thing goes further than we thought?" He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. We'll deal with it. Together. We've got each other's backs. The comfort of his words helped settle her, but the truth was, she wasn't sure if they were ready for what was coming. It had felt like they just scratched the surface of something much bigger than they had anticipated. Do you think we're safe here? She asked, glancing around the dimly lit space, as if expecting the bikers to burst through the doors at any moment. Marcus shook his head. No place is safe, Kyla. But we make our stand here, for now. Kyla nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. It was no longer just about protecting herself. It was about something bigger. The bikers had already shown their true colors, and it was clear they weren't going to just let things go. Kyla wasn't sure how far they would go, but she knew she couldn't let fear control her anymore. We'll get them, she said, her voice stronger than it had been earlier. Marcus gave her a small smile. That's the spirit. But for now, let's get out of here. We need to regroup, figure out our next move. They left the warehouse quietly, slipping out into the night. The air was cool against Kyla's skin, the distant hum of city traffic the only sound that filled the space around them. The city felt different now, as if it was watching them, waiting for the next chapter of their story to unfold. The ride back to Marcus's apartment was uneventful, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Kyla's mind raced as she tried to piece together everything that had happened. She had faced down the bikers, had made them back down, but at what cost? How much longer could they keep this up? When they finally reached the apartment, Marcus locked the door behind them. The apartment was small but cozy, a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed her life. The walls were lined with bookshelves, a few scattered photos of people Kyla didn't recognize. Sit down, Marcus instructed, gesturing to the couch. We need to talk about our next steps. Kyla obeyed, her legs still shaking from the adrenaline of their earlier confrontation. As she sank into the couch, Marcus started to pace the room, his hands running through his hair. We can't let this go any further, he said, his voice tight. The bikers aren't just going to drop this. They'll come after us again, and next time, it might be worse. Kyla exhaled slowly. What are we supposed to do? We get ahead of them, Marcus replied. We need to find out what they're planning, who they're working for, what their endgame is. Kyla's stomach twisted at the thought. How do we even do that? They don't exactly strike me as the type to share their plans. Marcus grinned, though it was a cold, calculated smile. That's where you come in. You've got more inside connections than you realize. Kyla frowned, not understanding. What do you mean? Your family, Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. You've got the connections. You've got people who can get us the information we need. People who can get us close to them. Kyla felt a wave of unease wash over her. She hadn't seen much of her family since the troubles started. Her parents, both working long hours in a world that never seemed to care about their struggle, had always pushed her to avoid getting involved in things that weren't her business. But this was her business. She swallowed hard, then nodded. Okay, I'll make some calls. Good, Marcus said, his voice firm. This fight isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone they've hurt, everyone they've threatened. And we're going to make sure they don't get away with it. Kyla stood up, her resolve solidifying. The fear was still there, deep in her gut, but she couldn't let it stop her. This was bigger than just a fight with the bikers. It was about taking back control, about making sure that no one else had to face the same terror that she had. I'm in, she said, her voice steady. Let's end this. Kyla sat at the kitchen table, phone pressed to her ear, staring out the window as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The city was waking up, oblivious to the storm that was slowly gathering in the shadows. Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, a nervous habit she hadn't been able to shake since she was a child. On the other end of the line, a familiar voice answered. Kyla? You okay? It was Tanya, her cousin. Kyla had always been close to her, despite the distance that had grown between them in recent years. Tanya was a few years older, a tech-savvy, no-nonsense kind of woman who had always been involved in the underground side of the city's dealings. She had connections, dangerous ones, and Kyla knew if anyone could help her now, it was Tanya. I need your help, Kyla said, her voice low. I'm in over my head. Tanya's tone immediately shifted. What happened? Are you safe? I'm safe, but things are about to get messy, Kyla replied, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to come barging in. The adrenaline of the night still hung heavy on her, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of urgency. She needed to act now before the bikers had a chance to regroup. Talk to me, Tanya urged. Kyla took a deep breath. There's this biker gang. They've been harassing me, threatening me, and they're not going to stop. I've got a lead on them. Something bigger than just some thugs causing trouble. But I need information. I need to know who's behind them, what they're planning. Can you help? There was a long pause before Tanya spoke again. You know what you're asking, right? This isn't just some petty feud. These guys are serious. They have connections everywhere. I know, Kyla replied, but I'm not backing down. I can't. This is bigger than me now. Tanya sighed, but it wasn't with hesitation. It was more like a resignation, as if she'd known this day would come. All right, I'll get what I can, but you need to be careful. Don't trust anyone you don't have to. Kyla smiled, a brief flash of relief cutting through the weight in her chest. Thanks, Tanya. I'll be careful. Good. I'll call you when I have something, Tanya said before hanging up. Kyla lowered the phone, her mind racing. With Tanya's help, they could uncover the truth about the bikers. But even with that knowledge, would it be enough to stop them? The answer was unclear, but what Kyla knew with absolute certainty was that she couldn't do this alone. She needed her family, her community, to stand with her. It was no longer just about protecting herself. It was about stopping the cycle of fear that the bikers had created. If they could dismantle their network, expose the corruption and violence that lay at the heart of it all, maybe, just maybe, there would be a way out. She stood up, determination filling her chest. There was no time to waste. The bikers wouldn't wait forever. And now, she had a chance to hit back. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a text message from Marcus. Meet me at the spot. We need to talk. Kyla didn't hesitate. She grabbed her jacket and headed out the door, the weight of the task ahead settling firmly on her shoulders. As she walked down the dimly lit street, she couldn't help but wonder what Marcus had planned. Every move they made from here on out had to be calculated. One mistake, and it could all unravel. The spot Marcus had mentioned was an old cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place where they could talk without worrying about being overheard. It was neutral ground, the kind of place where people from all walks of life could sit, talk, and disappear into the crowd. When she arrived, Marcus was already sitting at a table in the back, his eyes scanning the room. He looked up when she walked in, his expression serious, as always. You get what you needed? He asked as she slid into the seat across from him. Kyla nodded. Tanya's on it. She's going to get us some intel on the bikers, figure out who's pulling the strings. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Good, but we can't wait around. We need a plan for when this blows up in our faces. Kyla met his gaze. I know. We need to act fast. He hesitated before speaking again. I've been thinking. If we're going to take them down, we need more than just information. We need a way to hit them where it hurts, something they can't ignore. Like what? Kyla asked, her curiosity piqued. Marcus's gaze flickered toward the door, as if making sure they were still alone. We go public. Kyla frowned. What do you mean? I mean we expose them. All of it. Their operations, their connections. We make sure everyone knows what they're really doing. Kyla felt a knot form in her stomach. You're talking about going up against the whole network. If we do that, they won't just stop at us. They'll go after everyone we know. That's why we're not doing it alone, Marcus said. We'll find allies. People who have the power to protect us. People who want to see these guys taken down. Kyla thought for a moment, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. Going public would be a gamble, but it was also the only way to put an end to the violence. She had to trust that they could find a way to fight back. All right, she said, nodding. Let's do it. Marcus smiled grimly. Good. Now we just need to figure out how. The cafe had emptied by the time Kyla and Marcus stood up, their plans set in motion. The air outside was colder than usual, a chill that seemed to crawl into her bones as she walked beside him down the empty street. The sky was overcast, as if nature itself was bracing for the storm ahead. Kyla's mind buzzed with the weight of what they were about to do. Exposing the bikers, taking them down. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for everything she had left. Where do we start? Kyla asked, her voice steady despite the gnawing anxiety she felt. Marcus glanced at her, his expression hard. We need leverage. We start with the bikers network, their financials. Tanya can dig into their digital trail, but we'll need something physical too. Kyla stopped walking, turning to face him. You're talking about breaking into their operations, aren't you? He didn't flinch. It's the only way to get what we need. If we go public with the right evidence, we can break their hold. But it's going to be risky. Once we've got it, there's no going back. Kyla stared at him, weighing the risk. This wasn't just about the bikers anymore. It was about her life, her family, and everything she'd fought for. She had already been through too much to back down now. The fear that had once held her back was gone. There was no turning back. We do it, she said firmly. Let's hit them where it hurts. Marcus gave a quick nod, his face hardening. All right, but first, we need to bring in a few more people. You trust Tanya, right? Kyla nodded without hesitation. Yeah, she's got connections. She knows how to handle herself in these kinds of situations. Good. We'll need her help, and we'll need someone who can get us inside the bikers' operation. I know a guy. His name's Leo. He's been close to them for years, and he owes me a favor. Kyla raised an eyebrow. Leo? Who is he? Marcus hesitated for a moment before answering. He's an old contact. He's not someone I'd normally trust, but he knows the inner workings of their operations. If he's willing to help, we can use his knowledge to our advantage. Kyla wasn't sure if she liked the sound of working with someone Marcus described like that, but she knew it was a risk they had to take. All right, let's bring him in. But if he's playing both sides, we deal with him later. Marcus's lips twitched into a small smile. Agreed. They walked in silence for a while, the weight of the plan settling over them like a cloud. There was no room for mistakes. If they were going to take down the bikers, they had to move quickly, before the bikers figured out what they were up to. A few hours later, Kyla found herself standing outside a rundown bar on the edge of the city. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. Marcus had given her the address, and she knew Leo would be inside. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she had no choice but to trust Marcus's judgment, for now. Stay close, Marcus said quietly as they approached the entrance. Leo's a loose cannon, but if we play this right, we'll have the upper hand. Kyla nodded, her hand instinctively moving to her pocket, where she kept a small, concealed weapon. She wasn't naive enough to think the bikers wouldn't notice her if things went sideways. Inside, the bar smelled of stale beer and sweat. The music was loud, the kind of aggressive rock that felt as raw as the atmosphere. There were a few patrons scattered around, but it was clear this wasn't a place for casual drinkers. Everyone had their own agenda. At the far end of the bar, Kyla spotted him. Leo was leaning against the counter, nursing a drink, his eyes scanning the room. He was built like someone who had spent years working with dangerous people, solid, unyielding, but with a predatory edge to him. Marcus approached him first, and Kyla followed a few steps behind, watching their every move. Leo glanced up as they reached him, his lips curling into a grin. Well, Leo said, his voice smooth, but there was a hardness in his eyes. Didn't think I'd be seeing you two again. What's this about? Marcus didn't waste any time. We need information. You know where the bikers are keeping their stash, and we need access to their financials. Now. Leo's grin faltered for a split second, and Kyla could almost see the wheels turning in his head. He was weighing his options, deciding whether to help them or take advantage of the situation. You think I'm just going to hand that over? Leo asked, his tone colder now. You're asking for a lot. What's in it for me? Marcus's expression didn't change. You owe me. I saved your ass once, and now it's time for you to return the favor. Leo looked at Marcus, then Kyla. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to let him see any weakness. Finally, Leo sighed. All right, fine. I'll get you what you need, he said, his tone begrudging. But you better not forget what I'm doing for you. I won't, Marcus said, his voice firm. But we need it fast. No more games. Leo gave a curt nod. You'll have it. But don't come crawling to me if things go south. Kyla couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease as Leo turned to leave, disappearing into the back room of the bar. She had a bad feeling about this. That guy's trouble, she said quietly to Marcus. He glanced at her. Yeah, but he's useful. And right now, we need all the help we can get. Kyla looked back toward the door where Leo had disappeared. The weight of their mission was starting to sink in. They were getting closer to the bikers, but they were also stepping into a dangerous game. One wrong move, and everything could collapse. She couldn't let that happen. Not now. Kyla and Marcus stood in the shadow of the bar, waiting for Leo to return. The air had grown even colder, the sky overhead growing darker by the minute. Kyla's heart raced, a strange mix of anticipation and unease gnawing at her. She had come so far, but each step forward felt more dangerous than the last. How long do you think this will take? Kyla asked, breaking the silence. Marcus glanced at her, his face unreadable. Leo's a man of his word, but he doesn't move quickly. I'll give him another hour. If we don't hear from him by then, we'll make our move ourselves. Kyla nodded, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. She was growing restless, her fingers itching to do something, anything, to push them closer to their goal. They couldn't afford to waste time. If the bikers caught wind of their plan, it could all come crashing down. A sound from the bar's entrance interrupted her thoughts. Leo appeared, his usual confident swagger replaced by something more cautious. His eyes flickered to Marcus, then to Kyla, before he spoke in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. I've got what you need, Leo said, his voice hushed. But it's not going to come cheap. Marcus didn't flinch. Just tell us what it is. Leo reached into his jacket, pulling out a small envelope. He handed it over to Marcus, who took it without hesitation. This is the location of their main storage, the one you're looking for, Leo continued. It's a compound on the outskirts of town. But be warned, they're armed. You'll need more than just information to get in there. Kyla took the envelope from Marcus, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a map, marked with a location just a few miles away. It was a remote area, hidden from the main roads, perfect for a biker gang to operate without drawing too much attention. How do you know about this place? Kyla asked, her gaze still on the map. Leo smirked. Let's just say I've done business with these guys before. I know their operations better than anyone. You've been inside? Marcus asked, his voice sharp. Leo's eyes narrowed. Once or twice. But that was before things got complicated. I'm not going back in there, but I'll tell you what you need to know. He paused, his gaze shifting between Kyla and Marcus. You won't get far without backup. You need a team. And I'm not talking about just you two. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering Leo's words. You want us to get more people involved? He asked finally. Leo nodded. The bikers won't go down easily. If you want to make it out alive, and with the goods, you'll need to hit them hard and fast. Trust me, this isn't a job for two people. Kyla felt her pulse quicken. She knew Leo was right. They couldn't go into this alone. The bikers were ruthless, and they had the firepower to match. But the idea of bringing in more people, of expanding their small operation, made her uneasy. She'd never trusted many people, and trusting others in this high-stakes game felt like a risk. We'll think about it, Marcus said, his tone firm. But we're moving tonight. I don't want to give them time to react. Leo's lips twisted into a knowing grin. Good. But don't say I didn't warn you. You'll need more than just brains to pull this off. Kyla didn't reply, her mind already racing through the possibilities. They needed muscle, but who could they trust? They couldn't afford to waste time vetting people, but they also couldn't risk bringing in someone who might sell them out. We'll handle it, Kyla said, looking up from the map. Thanks for the tip. Leo raised an eyebrow. You'll be thanking me later, when you're swimming in cash. Just remember, I'm not doing this out of the goodness of my heart. Marcus didn't respond, only gave a brief nod. We'll take care of the rest. Leo lingered for a moment, then turned to leave, disappearing into the night. As he walked away, Kyla's unease grew. She didn't like dealing with people like Leo, people who had their own agendas. But she knew that in order to take down the bikers, they couldn't afford to be picky. Turning to Marcus, she asked, "What now?" "Now we prepare," he replied. "We move out in the next few hours. Get everything you need ready." Kyla nodded, feeling a sense of urgency rise within her. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the one that would change everything. The bikers had pushed her to the edge. Now it was time to push back. The clock was ticking. Kyla moved swiftly through her apartment, grabbing the gear she knew she would need for the operation. A tactical vest. Extra ammo. Her hands worked on autopilot as she checked her phone, reading over the messages she had received from Marcus about their plan. They would meet up in an hour, ready to take on the bikers once and for all. But even as she prepared, doubt lingered in her mind. This was dangerous. It was a risk she hadn't fully calculated. They had the location, but the bikers were not going to let them waltz in without a fight. They had weapons, power, and numbers on their side. And for a fleeting moment, Kyla wondered if this was a fight they could win. She pushed the thought aside. There was no going back now. She had already come too far to turn back. After securing her gear and checking the map one last time, she grabbed her jacket and headed out the door. The air was cold, a sharp wind biting at her exposed skin. She pulled the collar of her jacket up, moving swiftly toward the meeting point. Every step felt heavier, the weight of what was to come pressing down on her. She could already hear the rumble of motorcycle engines in the distance, the unmistakable sound of the bikers' presence. When she arrived at the warehouse, Marcus was already there, his eyes scanning the area. He looked up when he saw her approaching, his expression serious but resolute. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low. Kyla nodded, keeping her own nerves in check. "Let's do this." They didn't waste time. The two of them made their way to the back of the warehouse, where they would meet the small team they'd assembled. Leo had been right. They needed backup. And although Kyla didn't fully trust all of them, there was no turning back. They had to stick together if they wanted any chance of taking down the bikers. The team consisted of three others: Cade, a former soldier who'd served in Iraq; Elena, a tech expert who had a knack for breaking into secure systems; and Jamal, a street-savvy hustler with connections in the underground world. They weren't friends, but they had one thing in common: a burning desire to see the bikers put down for good. As Kyla walked into the dimly lit room where the team was gathering, she was greeted with nods of acknowledgement, but little in the way of pleasantries. Everyone knew why they were here. "How's the plan looking?" Kyla asked, addressing Marcus first. "Solid," he replied, checking the map. "We hit them at dawn. We've got about a 2-hour window before the bikers are expecting us. Once we're in, we'll take out the guards and hit the storage. Elena's got the access codes. Cade, Jamal, and I will handle the security. You're with me, Kyla?" Kyla nodded, trying to shake off the tension she felt in her gut. This was it. No more planning. No more second-guessing. They were going in. Elena, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "I've got eyes on the compound already. Security is tight, but not impenetrable. I'll be able to hack into their systems and disable the cameras for about 10 minutes, give you a window to make your move. But after that, it's all on you." "I don't need the cameras down for long," Kyla said, her voice firm. "Just long enough to get in. We move fast. No mistakes." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "We hit hard and leave with what we came for." Cade, a big man with a quiet demeanor, checked his gear one last time. "You sure about this, Kyla?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. "This isn't a small-time robbery. These bikers don't play around." "I'm sure," she replied, her tone steady. "We've got the element of surprise. That's all we need." Jamal, the last to speak, laughed darkly. "It's not the surprise that worries me. It's what happens when the bikers realize they've been robbed by a group of strangers. Trust me, we need more than just surprise. We need firepower." "I know what I'm doing," Kyla said, meeting his gaze. "Let's just stick to the plan. We go in, we hit them hard, and we leave. No one gets hurt if we do this, right?" There was a moment of silence as everyone considered her words. Finally, Marcus spoke. "All right then, let's get ready. In 1 hour, we move out." The group broke off to gather their things. Kyla's heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. As she adjusted the straps on her tactical vest, she reminded herself why she was doing this. This wasn't just about the bikers anymore. This was about taking back control of her life, about showing the world that she wouldn't be intimidated. No one was going to stand in her way, not anymore. The night stretched long, the silence of the warehouse only broken by the occasional shuffle of boots or the quiet hum of technology as Elena set up her equipment. Kyla found herself staring at the map once again, memorizing every detail of the layout. Her fingers traced the path they would take through the compound, marking the guards, the security cameras, and the hidden routes. She knew that tomorrow would change everything. Kyla sat alone in the corner, away from the others, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The weight of the mission was starting to sink in, the risk of it all. What if something went wrong? What if someone got hurt? The bikers were ruthless, and though they had a plan, plans could go wrong fast. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from her sister, Maya. You good? Be careful tomorrow. Love you. Kyla smiled softly, a brief moment of warmth in the cold, tense atmosphere. Maya had no idea what was coming, but her words were a reminder of what she was fighting for. She was doing this not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed down by people like the bikers. She wasn't going to let them ruin another life, especially not hers. She quickly typed back a response. I'm fine. Don't worry. Love you too. The next hour passed in a blur, and before she knew it, Marcus was motioning for the group to gather around. It was time. As the team assembled in the main area of the warehouse, Kyla could see the focus in their eyes. There was no room for doubt now. This was it. They couldn't back out. Elena stepped forward, holding up a small device that looked like a handheld gaming console. I've hacked into their surveillance system. Once we're in position, I'll disable their cameras for 10 minutes. We move fast, no hesitation. Kate gave her a nod. We know the drill. Once the cameras are down, we hit the perimeter, neutralize the guards, and get to the storage. Elena, you're on the tech. Jamal and I will handle the rest. Just make sure we don't get caught, Jamal added, his voice low. I'm not looking for a firefight. Kyla stepped up to the front, her voice calm but commanding. We do this quick. We go in, hit them hard, and leave. No heroics, no second chances. We stick to the plan, and we'll get out without a scratch. Everyone nodded. There was no room for failure. Marcus clapped his hands together. All right, everyone get your gear. We move out in 5. As the team dispersed to collect their things, Kyla's mind was already racing through the plan again. She would lead the way, just as she had planned. The bikers wouldn't know what hit them. The team gathered outside the warehouse under the cover of darkness. The cold wind whipped around them as they got into position. Kyla's heart pounded as she looked over at Marcus. They shared a look, a silent understanding between them. This wasn't just a job. This was personal. With a nod from Marcus, they started toward the compound. The streets were empty, the silence pressing in as they moved. Kyla's footsteps were light but purposeful, her senses heightened, every nerve alive with anticipation. They were about to take on the bikers, but the real challenge wouldn't come until they faced what was waiting inside. The bikers had been terrorizing this town for too long, and Kyla wasn't about to let them keep doing it. As they neared the compound, the sound of motorcycles reached their ears. Kyla's grip tightened on her weapon, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The plan was set. Now, all they had to do was execute it. The compound loomed ahead, its walls tall and imposing, casting long shadows under the dim streetlights. Kyla could hear the rumble of motorcycle engines nearby, the sounds of her enemies growing louder with every step they took. She motioned for the team to halt just before the entrance, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. Positions, Marcus whispered. Elena, Jamal, and Cade split off, slipping into their assigned spots like shadows. Kyla stayed close to Marcus, her heart pounding in her chest as she adjusted her grip on her weapon. The feeling of anticipation was thick in the air, almost suffocating. Everything was on the line now. As they moved into position, Elena's voice crackled through their earpieces. Surveillance down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The lights near the security cameras flickered and then went dark. Kyla didn't hesitate. The signal was clear. Time to move. Let's go, Kyla said, her voice steady. They moved quickly, ducking behind crates and vehicles, making their way through the compound without a sound. Kyla led the charge, her instincts guiding her every step. The faint sound of footsteps and muffled voices told her that the bikers hadn't noticed yet. But it wouldn't be long before they did. They reached the perimeter, where the first guards were posted. Kyla signaled for Jamal and Cade to handle them. They were the best at staying unnoticed, blending into the shadows until the moment came. A moment later, the first guard fell, silent as a ghost. The second guard didn't even have a chance to scream before Cade had him on the ground, unconscious. Elena's voice came through again. You're clear. Move up to the storage. Kyla nodded, signaling the team forward. The storage area was ahead, and that's where the real work would begin. As they approached the building, the faint sound of motorcycles revving echoed in the distance. The bikers were starting to realize something was wrong, but it was too late. Kyla and her team had already breached the outer defenses. Inside the storage building, they found what they were looking for. Rows of stolen goods, weapons, and drugs stacked high. This was the heart of the biker gang's operation. But as Kyla stepped forward, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A group of bikers were gathered near the back, unaware of the team's approach. She motioned for the team to halt. There were too many of them, and if they were spotted now, the mission would fail. Elena, Kyla whispered into the comms, can you shut down their radios and alert systems? We can't have them calling reinforcements. On it, Elena replied, her fingers tapping away at the controls. Give me 10 seconds. The seconds felt like hours. Kyla's mind raced, calculating every possible outcome. She had to act fast before the bikers figured out what was happening. Every step they took now was a step closer to danger. Just as the tension was becoming unbearable, Elena's voice came through. Done. All communication lines are down. Kyla nodded. Move in. With a surge of energy, the team charged forward. The bikers were caught off guard, but they quickly reached for their weapons, ready to fight. Kyla didn't give them the chance. She was faster, moving like a force of nature, disarming one biker and taking down another in seconds. The sound of gunfire echoed through the building, but Kyla was already ahead of the chaos, her eyes locked on the leader of the gang. A towering figure with tattoos covering his arms and a scar running down his face. He sneered at her, his hands gripping a knife as he advanced. This is your last mistake, girl, he growled. Kyla didn't flinch. She knew what she had to do. The knife was nothing compared to the resolve in her heart. You're done, Kyla said coldly, her voice unwavering. With a swift movement, she disarmed him, spinning the knife out of his hand and pinning him to the ground in one fluid motion. Enough, she said, looking down at him. You're finished here. As the rest of the bikers were subdued by her team, Kyla could feel the weight of the moment. They had done it. They had taken down the bikers' operation, disrupted their hold on the town, and sent a clear message. But this was only the beginning. The air in the storage room was thick with the scent of gasoline and dust. The bikers had been secured, tied up and awaiting transport, their faces pale and confused, as though they couldn't understand how a few people had managed to bring down their empire so swiftly. Kyla stood amidst the wreckage of their operation, the adrenaline slowly wearing off, leaving behind an uncomfortable void. They had won, yes, but at what cost? Kyla's gaze swept over her team. Marcus, Elena, Jamal, and Cade. They were all here, standing strong. But she knew this victory wasn't without its sacrifices. There was still so much left to be done. Clear the area, Kyla commanded, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of weariness. We don't have much time before reinforcements arrive. We need to move fast. The team nodded, immediately getting to work, hauling the bikers outside and preparing them for transport. Elena had already tapped into the local police network to alert authorities about the bust, ensuring that the bikers would face justice without interference from outside forces. Kyla took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had known this day was coming, but now that it was here, the weight of the responsibility was heavier than ever. This was only one battle in a much larger war. All done, Elena said, her voice tight with focus. We've got everything on lock. Local PD is en route. The compound's already being cleared of evidence. It's over. Kyla nodded. Good. But we're not done yet. There's still more work to be done. We can't let them rebuild, not like last time. Marcus stepped up, a rare note of hesitation in his voice. Kyla, I know this isn't what you wanted, but there were casualties. We lost some good people along the way. The reminder hit her like a punch to the gut. The faces of the fallen flashed in her mind. Good people, loyal to the cause, lost in the chaos of a war that had no clear end. We knew what we were getting into, she said quietly, trying to hide the pain. It's always been this way. Sacrifice is part of the deal. But it doesn't make it any easier, Marcus added, his eyes dark with understanding. Kyla looked around the room at her team, each of them battered but unbroken. We can mourn later, she said, her voice hardening. Right now, we keep moving. This is just the beginning. Kyla sat alone in the small, dimly lit room at the back of the compound. Her fingers lightly traced the edges of a photograph, a reminder of the life she'd left behind, a life that seemed so far away now. It was her mother, smiling warmly, her arms wrapped around a younger Kyla. They had been close once, before the streets, before the danger, before everything became about survival. The sound of the door creaking open pulled her from her thoughts. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face grim. They've been talking, he said quietly, taking a step inside. The bikers, they're not just a gang. They're a part of something bigger. Kyla's heart skipped a beat. Bigger how? Marcus shook his head. We're not the first to take them down. There's a network, an underground operation that spans across the country. These bikers? They're just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Kyla's mind raced. The implications of this were staggering. If what Marcus said was true, then they were up against something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. This wasn't just a battle for the streets of their town. It was a battle for control of a much larger empire. We need to figure out who's pulling the strings, Kyla said, determination flooding her veins. We need to strike at the heart of this before it spreads any further. Agreed, Marcus replied, his voice heavy with the weight of the task ahead. But we have to be careful. We've made some enemies today, and there are people out there who won't hesitate to make us pay. Kyla stood up, tucking the photograph into her pocket. Let them try. We've survived this long. We'll survive whatever comes next. The storm was just beginning, but Kyla knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The following day, the tension was palpable. Kyla and her team gathered at their makeshift headquarters, a nondescript warehouse tucked away on the outskirts of town. The place was fortified, with layers of security and a constant watch for any potential threats. But even within these walls, Kyla couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. We've got intel, Elena spoke, her tone serious as she slid a manila folder across the table. A few of the bikers we nabbed yesterday are talking. They're rattling off about something bigger, something international. They're linked to a criminal syndicate, and this is just one chapter of a larger operation. Kyla opened the folder, skimming through the reports. Her eyes narrowed as she read the names, the connections, the whispers of cartel involvement. Her stomach churned. The bikers weren't just the muscle. They were the foot soldiers for something far more insidious. Who's at the top? Kyla asked, her voice low. Elena hesitated. We don't know yet. The chain's pretty deep. But there's a name they keep bringing up, a man named Victor Rojas. He's the one behind the scenes pulling strings. Rumor has it, he's untouchable. Kyla clenched her fists. Not untouchable for long. Jamal, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. We go after Rojas. We're stepping into the lion's den. This isn't just about the bikers anymore. We'll be fighting against an army. Kyla's eyes hardened. Then we'll need an army of our own. We can't let this slide. If Rojas is as dangerous as they say, he's only going to grow stronger. We have to strike first. Cade, who had been monitoring the local news feed, interrupted. They're already making moves. There's been a spike in gang activity around the city. Some of the bikers who got away yesterday are mobilizing. It's like they're preparing for something big. Kyla stood up, her mind racing. Then it's time to move. We can't wait any longer. If Rojas is assembling his forces, we need to hit hard and fast. No more waiting around. She turned to her team, her resolve clear in her eyes. We go after Rojas. We find him, and we bring him down, whatever it takes. The hours stretched into the night as Kyla and her team prepped for the mission ahead. They were going dark, using every resource at their disposal to locate Rojas and his operation. Elena had tapped into local surveillance systems. Jamal was working his network of informants, and Cade was sifting through the encrypted communications they had intercepted from the bikers. But even as they worked tirelessly, the weight of what they were about to face pressed down on them. They were no longer dealing with petty criminals or low-level gangs. They were up against a well-organized criminal empire with resources, connections, and power that stretched far beyond their reach. Kyla could feel the tension building, but she knew there was no turning back. They had to act now, before Rojas could expand his operation even further. "We've got a lead," Cade finally said, his voice crackling with urgency. "There's a compound just outside the city, secluded, heavily guarded. Our intel points to it being Rojas's base of operations." Kyla's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. They were close, closer than ever before. "We move out in 20 minutes, she said, her voice cold and firm. "Prepare yourselves. This is going to get ugly." The ride to the compound was tense, each member of the team silently preparing for what was to come. The hum of the engines and the soft glow of streetlights passing by did little to ease the mounting pressure in Kyla's chest. She kept her eyes on the road, her mind racing through every possible outcome. They were going to hit Rojas's base hard, but what if it wasn't enough? What if they weren't ready for what they'd find there? As they neared the compound, the moonlight cast an eerie glow over the tall, barbed wire fences. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements slow and methodical. Kyla's team had trained for this moment, but no amount of preparation could fully ready them for the danger that awaited them. "This is it," Kyla muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stick to the plan. We move in fast, we hit them hard, and we take Rojas alive." The vehicle screeched to a halt just outside the compound's gates. Kyla was the first out, her boots hitting the ground with a quiet thud. The team followed closely behind, their movements synchronized as they made their way toward the compound's entrance. "Ready?" Kyla asked, her voice steely. The team nodded, weapons at the ready. They were about to walk into the heart of darkness, and there was no turning back. The tension was almost suffocating as Kyla and her team approached the gates of the compound. Every step they took was calculated, each member of the team aware of the risks they faced. The air was thick with anticipation, and Kyla could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. "Keep your heads down," she whispered, as they neared the heavily guarded entrance. The compound was surrounded by thick walls, and the guards on patrol were armed to the teeth. But they were ready. Kyla had spent years honing her skills for moments like this. They would infiltrate the compound quickly, take down the guards, and secure Rojas before he could escape. As they reached the gates, Jamal motioned to a small panel on the side, concealed behind some overgrown foliage. "The control box," he said quietly. "I can disable the security system from here." Kyla nodded, her eyes scanning the perimeter. "Do it." Jamal moved swiftly, his fingers working expertly to hack into the security panel. The digital hum of the system shutting down was almost inaudible, but Kyla knew they had a small window of time before anyone noticed. "We're in," Jamal said, his voice barely audible over the sound of their movements. Kyla gestured for the team to advance. "We move fast. This place isn't going to stay quiet for long." They entered through the now unlocked gates, their footsteps light but purposeful. Inside the compound, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, oil, and metal. The vast complex was dark, lit only by dim lights scattered in strategic corners. There were warehouses, barracks, and hidden rooms, too many places where Rojas could be hiding. As they navigated deeper into the compound, Elena whispered into her comms, "I've got eyes on a few of Rojas's men. They're moving around the east wing. No signs of Rojas himself yet, but he's definitely here." "Stay focused," Kyla responded, her voice steely. "We keep moving. No mistakes." They reached the first checkpoint, a security room where they encountered two guards. It was quick. Jamal and Cade took them down in silence, neutralizing the threat before the alarms could be raised. Kyla led them forward, keeping her eyes sharp and her movements fluid. But the closer they got to the center of the compound, the more the hairs on Kyla's neck stood up. Something felt wrong. The silence was unsettling, too quiet for a place this large and heavily fortified. "Why aren't they reacting?" Cade murmured, as they took cover behind a stack of crates, peering through the shadows at a distant guard post. "There should be more activity." "Maybe they know we're coming," Kyla muttered. "Or maybe they're waiting for us to get too deep in. Let's not give them the chance." They pressed on, deeper into the labyrinth of the compound. The uneasy feeling in Kyla's gut grew stronger with every step, but there was no turning back now. They had come too far to fail. "Something's wrong," Elena said suddenly. "There's too much silence. No backup, no radios. It's almost as if they're luring us into a trap." Kyla froze, her eyes scanning the area ahead. "How deep is it, Elena? Any sign of Rojas?" Elena's fingers flew across her tablet, flipping through encrypted files. "Nothing concrete, but we're getting closer. Just a little more, and we'll have eyes on the central building. It's where the intel suggests he's holed up." Kyla's jaw tightened. "No time to waste. Move out." They rounded the corner, the large central building looming before them. But just as they made their way toward the entrance, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the compound. "Get down," Kyla hissed. The team quickly ducked behind a stack of crates, just as a group of armed men rounded the corner. There were at least a dozen of them, all heavily armed, all looking in their direction. Kyla's heart raced as she assessed their chances. "We're not getting out of this without a fight," Jamal said grimly. Kyla nodded. No turning back now. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and then, like a gunshot shattering the silence, Kyla raised her weapon and shouted, "Move!" The firefight erupted instantly. Bullets whizzed by, and the team dove for cover. The guards reacted quickly, but Kyla and her team were faster. They had trained for moments like this, their movements synchronized as they took down one target after another. But the compound wasn't just guarded, it was fortified. Behind every corner, another wave of bikers came at them. It was a relentless assault, one that tested their resolve and their ability to stay one step ahead. The air was thick with smoke, the sounds of gunfire deafening. Kyla fired a quick shot, taking down a guard who had appeared on the roof. She peered around the corner, her heart racing. The building was so close, and yet, the more they fought, the more overwhelming the resistance became. She could feel Rojas's men tightening their grip, pushing them further into a corner. "Time to go," Cade shouted, his voice sharp through the comms. "We're getting too deep. We need to fall back." Kyla's grip tightened around her weapon, but her mind was already working. "We push forward," she said, her voice steady. "We get Rojas, and we take him out of this picture. No retreat." "Understood," Jamal said, his voice unwavering. They surged forward again, a storm of bullets and flashes as they pushed deeper into the heart of the compound. Every second felt like an eternity, but they kept moving, closer and closer to Rojas, to the end of the line. The walls seemed to close in around them as they approached the central building. Kyla's mind raced, and every muscle in her body was on high alert. The sound of gunfire and shouts filled the air, but there was no turning back now. Rojas was close. She could feel it. He had to be. "Hold tight," she whispered to the team. "Stay close." They moved swiftly, their footsteps muffled by the heavy thud of their boots on the concrete floor. The large metal door to the central building loomed in front of them, a solid barrier between them and their target. It was time to end this, to put an end to Rojas's reign of terror. But as Kyla reached for the door handle, she froze. A low, menacing chuckle echoed from within. "I've been expecting you." Kyla's eyes narrowed. She spun around, her hand gripping her weapon tightly. Rojas stood there, flanked by two heavily armed bodyguards, a smug smile playing on his lips. His presence was unnerving, like a dark cloud looming over everything. "I knew you'd come for me," Rojas continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. "But you're too late. You've already lost." The team tensed, their weapons aimed at Rojas and his guards. The air was thick with tension, each side preparing for what could be the final confrontation. "Not today," Kyla shot back, her voice icy. "This ends now." She stepped forward, her eyes locked on Rojas. "You've hurt too many people. It's time for you to face the consequences." Rojas laughed again, a hollow, sinister sound. "You think you can stop me? I have more power than you could ever understand. The law? The system? They're nothing compared to what I have." Kyla's jaw clenched, but she didn't flinch. "You're about to find out just how much you're mistaken." The air felt heavy, suffocating. Time seemed to slow as both sides prepared for a fight. Kyla's team was ready, their bodies taut with anticipation, eyes trained on their targets. But then, just as they were about to make their move, the unexpected happened. A loud crack rang through the air as the door behind Rojas exploded open, sending debris flying in all directions. The force of the blast threw everyone off balance, and the guards immediately spun around, firing wildly. Kyla instinctively dropped to the ground, covering her head as the room erupted into chaos. But through the dust and smoke, she saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face shadowed by the debris. He moved with purpose, his steps deliberate and controlled, and in his hand, he held a weapon unlike any Kyla had ever seen. "Who the hell is that?" Elena whispered into the comms. Kyla's eyes narrowed. "I don't know, but I don't think he's here to help us." Before she could react, the man raised his weapon, aiming directly at Rojas. There was a brief moment of silence, and then, bang! The sound of the gunshot echoed through the room, and Rojas collapsed to the floor, his body twitching violently. His guards hesitated, unsure of what to do. The mysterious man lowered his weapon, his eyes scanning the room with cold precision. "Move in," Kyla shouted, taking advantage of the distraction. She and her team advanced quickly, guns raised, their training kicking in as they took down Rojas's remaining men. The man didn't flinch as the battle raged around him. He simply stepped to the side, watching with a cold, calculating gaze. Kyla's heart pounded in her chest. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice hoarse from the adrenaline. The man didn't respond at first. Instead, he walked toward Rojas's lifeless body, kneeling beside it. He spoke in a low, almost imperceptible voice. "Rojas wasn't the one you needed to worry about." Kyla's mind raced, her pulse quickening. What did he mean by that? Who was this man, and why had he helped them? Before she could ask another question, the man stood up and turned toward her. "Your fight isn't over," he said, his voice low but commanding. "But it's not with him." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, disappearing into the shadows from which he had emerged. Kyla stood frozen for a moment, her team slowly regaining their composure. The silence that followed was deafening. The danger was far from over, and the mystery of the man lingered in the air, like a heavy fog. "Do we follow him?" Jamal asked, his voice tight. Kyla hesitated, but she knew what she had to do. "No," she said, her voice steady. "We've got what we came for. Rojas is done. The rest will come in time." But as she glanced at the lifeless body of Rojas, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle had only just begun. And the man who had saved them? He was only a piece of a much bigger puzzle. Kyla and her team had successfully neutralized Rojas, but the events that followed left her with more questions than answers. The mysterious man's warning echoed in her mind, leaving her with a nagging sense of unease. "Your fight isn't over." As they began to search the compound for any remaining evidence, Kyla couldn't help but think about the strange encounter. Who was the man? What did he mean by "your fight isn't over"? The answers she needed were just beyond her reach, but she knew one thing for certain. The battle for justice wasn't finished, and she was prepared to face whatever came next. Kyla stared at the empty doorway where the mysterious man had vanished. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of uncertainty, trying to make sense of the strange turn of events. Everything had been leading up to this moment, the takedown of Rojas, the final showdown, but something about the encounter didn't sit right. It wasn't over, not yet. "Do you think he's with someone?" Elena asked, breaking the silence as she dusted herself off and looked toward Kyla. Her voice was laced with the same confusion. Could be, Kyla replied, her mind racing, but I don't know who would send someone like him. He wasn't just a bystander. He knew exactly what he was doing. Maybe he's one of Rojas's people? Jamal suggested, glancing at the body of the fallen cartel leader. He could have been another hired gun, but it seems like he came for Rojas himself. Kyla shook her head. It didn't feel like that. This man didn't seem like someone who was just following orders. There was something deeper about him, something calculated. We need to focus, Kyla said, trying to regain her bearings. The building's secure for now. Let's finish the sweep. There might be intel here that will help us figure this out. But as they moved deeper into the compound, the weight of Rojas's death began to settle over Kyla like a heavy fog. They'd been chasing him for months, and now he was gone. No more leads. No more trail. He'd been the embodiment of the cartel's power and corruption. But in the end, he was just a man. Vulnerable, mortal. There had to be more to this story. Kyla felt it in her gut. Hours later, at the command center, Kyla stood before a whiteboard covered in photos and maps of the cartel's operations. She crossed her arms, studying the information like it held the key to everything. We're missing something, she muttered, scanning the faces of her team. Rojas was a piece of the puzzle, but who's pulling the strings? Could it be his boss? Maybe the real power's someone else? Jamal suggested. Someone higher up? Kyla paused, considering. Maybe. But we know Rojas wasn't the top of the food chain. He had connections, but he was just one part of a much bigger operation. We need to find the person pulling the strings. Elena tapped a few buttons on her tablet, pulling up a map of recent cartel activity. We've tracked their supply lines, but nothing out of the ordinary. All the money leads back to a single entity, a shell corporation based in the city. It's practically a ghost operation. No names, no faces. Figures, Kyla muttered. Whoever's behind this is staying out of sight, but we're getting closer. Just as she was about to ask Elena to dig deeper, her phone buzzed. The number was unknown. She hesitated before answering. This is Kyla. A low, familiar voice crackled through the line. I see you've made it this far, but you're not going to like what comes next. Kyla's heart skipped. The voice, cold, calculating, was unmistakable. It was the man from the compound. Who is this? Kyla demanded, her pulse quickening. She glanced around at her team, their expressions tense. The man laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill down her spine. I think you know who I am, but we don't have much time. Rojas was just a pawn, Kyla. You've killed the wrong man. Her mind raced, but she didn't flinch. What do you want? To make sure you understand the game you're playing, he said cryptically. You've been chasing ghosts, but now you're in over your head. Kyla's jaw clenched. What do you mean? What game are you talking about? I'm not here to help you, the man said, his tone dark. But I'm going to give you one piece of advice. The real target isn't Rojas. You've been following the wrong trail. The line went dead before she could respond. Her phone screen went blank. Kyla stood frozen for a moment, absorbing the words. The real target isn't Rojas. She turned to her team, her mind already working. We need to track down whoever's behind Rojas. And we need to do it fast. Kyla's team worked through the night, combing through the files, connecting dots, and following the money trail that had been left behind. But despite their efforts, they were no closer to finding the elusive mastermind behind Rojas's operations. Hours stretched into the early morning, and fatigue began to wear on them. But Kyla's resolve only hardened. We're missing something, Kyla said, leaning over the desk, her eyes scanning the data in front of her. There's a pattern here. This corporation, it's a cover. Someone's hiding behind it. Elena tapped at her tablet, running another search. I'm looking into the CEO, but there's nothing, no past, no background. Whoever this is, they're careful. Suddenly, Jamal's voice cut through the quiet. Wait, there's a discrepancy in the financials. One of these shell accounts. This isn't a corporation. It's a front for something bigger. Kyla's eyes locked onto the screen. What do you mean? It's connected to a series of large-scale investments. And there's an offshore account tied to it. But here's the kicker. This offshore account is linked to several high-profile individuals. Government officials. business leaders, even law enforcement. Kyla's stomach dropped. A cartel with connections like that? No wonder we couldn't find the real players. They've been hiding in plain sight. She turned toward the map on the wall. The web of connections, once seemingly random, was starting to form a pattern, and at the center was something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. "Get ready," Kyla said, her voice hard as steel. "We're not just up against criminals anymore. We're fighting an enemy that has embedded itself in every part of society." Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was clear. "It's too late to stop it now." The room was silent except for the hum of computers and the faint rustle of paper as Kyla's team absorbed the gravity of the situation. They weren't just fighting criminals. They were up against an entrenched network that was part of the very fabric of society, an insidious force that controlled everything from law enforcement to the highest echelons of business and politics. Kyla's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she reviewed the encrypted documents on the screen. The offshore accounts leading to anonymous figures hidden behind layers of false identities. The scope of it all was suffocating. "We've been chasing shadows," Elena muttered. "This isn't just a cartel. This is a full-scale operation with tentacles everywhere." Jamal nodded grimly. "We've only scratched the surface, but we have to start somewhere. We need names, locations, something to tie it all together." Kyla paced the room, the wheels of her mind spinning faster than ever. She was used to going up against dangerous people, but this was something entirely different. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing for money or power. They were playing for control, for influence that reached far beyond the drug trade. "Okay," Kyla said, stopping in her tracks. "We need to focus. First, let's isolate the money trail, find out where it all funnels back to. If we can get to the root of this operation, we might be able to cut it off before it spreads any further." Suddenly, her phone rang again. The number was unfamiliar, but the feeling in her gut told her it wasn't just another coincidence. She answered it without hesitation. "Kyla." The voice on the other end was smooth, but with an undeniable threat hanging in the air. "I warned you. You've made things much more complicated than they needed to be." Her heart raced as she recognized the voice from before. The man, the one who had disappeared from the compound. His words echoed in her mind. "The real target isn't Rojas." "Who are you?" Kyla demanded, keeping her voice steady. "What do you want?" There was a pause, and she could almost hear the amusement in his tone. "What I want, Kyla, is for you to realize that this is bigger than you, bigger than your team. You've been digging in the wrong place." Kyla's fists clenched. "Enough with the games. Tell me who you are." "You'll know soon enough," the man replied cryptically. "But not before it's too late. You should have stayed out of this. You're just one piece of the puzzle, and you won't be able to stop it." Before she could respond, the line went dead. The room fell silent once more, but the tension in the air was palpable. Everyone was staring at Kyla, awaiting her next move. She could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. This was no longer just about justice, it was about survival. "We're getting closer," Kyla said, her voice cold with determination. "But whoever's behind this isn't going to give up easily. We need to move fast. Get to the source of the money. Find out who's funding this operation. I don't care what it takes, we're ending this now." With renewed urgency, Kyla's team dove deeper into their investigation. The network of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and anonymous entities seemed to stretch infinitely, but Kyla wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. The financial records were filled with red flags, transactions leading to the same mysterious figures, but each one more elusive than the last. Every lead seemed to circle back to one central location, a high-rise building in the heart of the city, owned by a company with no public presence, no website, no records, nothing. It was a ghost entity, but it was clearly the hub of something much larger. "We need eyes on that building," Kyla said. "It's time to pay it a visit." Elena nodded, already pulling up the building's address on her tablet. "It's heavily guarded. No one gets in without a fight." Jamal smirked. "Then we'll just have to be creative." As the team prepared to move out, Kyla's mind raced. She had a sinking feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something far darker than they had imagined. This was no longer just about a cartel. It was about an organized system of power that extended into every corner of society. The black SUVs, the high-end cars, the hidden accounts, they were all part of the same machine. The people behind this weren't just criminals. They were the ones pulling the strings behind the curtain. As they approached the building, Kyla's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number, but a message. You've come too far. Turn back now, or face the consequences. Kyla's eyes narrowed as she read the message. It was the same threat, the same warning. They weren't just being hunted by criminals. They were up against an entire system that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. But there was no turning back now. Move out, Kyla said, her voice hard. We're going in. The sleek, glass-fronted high-rise loomed ahead, the lights of the city casting an eerie glow over the entrance. Kyla's team approached cautiously, moving through the shadows as they neared the building. They had come too far to turn back, and the man's warning only strengthened their resolve. As they reached the front doors, Kyla signaled to Jamal, who quickly hacked into the security system. The door clicked open with a faint buzz, and the team slipped inside. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled on the polished floors. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide something, or someone, watching them. The building was eerily quiet, too quiet. Eyes open, Kyla whispered, her hand gripping her gun. We don't know who we're dealing with yet. They made their way up to the top floor, where the building's penthouse suite awaited. It was the nerve center of the operation. The air grew thicker with each step, the sense of danger palpable. As they reached the door to the penthouse, Kyla's heart raced. This was it, the moment of truth. They had come so far, and now they were about to uncover the true face of the enemy. She pushed open the door, and what she saw inside took her breath away. The room was lavishly furnished, but it was the man sitting at the desk that caught her attention. The same man who had taunted her over the phone, the one who had warned her not to come. And as he turned to face her, a chilling smile crept across his face. You're too late, Kyla, he said, his voice cold and unwavering. Welcome to the end of the line. Kyla's breath caught in her chest as she took a step forward, her eyes locked onto the man at the desk. His cold, calculating expression sent a chill down her spine. He didn't seem worried. In fact, he looked almost amused, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. You know who I am, don't you? He asked, his voice smooth and menacing. You've been chasing ghosts, Kyla, thinking you were fighting criminals. But the truth is far more dangerous than you could ever imagine. Kyla's team stood at the doorway, ready for anything, but it was clear they were just as stunned by the revelation. Elena's hand hovered over her weapon, but she made no move. Jamal's jaw was clenched, his eyes scanning the room for threats, but all he could see was the man, calm, composed, and in control. Who are you? Kyla asked, her voice steadier than she felt. She refused to give him the satisfaction of showing weakness. The man smiled again, his teeth sharp in the dim light. I'm someone who's been pulling the strings for a very long time. You think you've uncovered a cartel or a network of criminals? What if I told you the people you've been chasing, Rojas, the bikers, even the ones you thought were your allies, are just pawns? They're part of a much bigger game, Kyla. Kyla's heart sank. She was no longer dealing with petty criminals. She was facing an enemy that transcended everything she'd known. An enemy that was as embedded in society as it was hidden in the shadows. Why are you doing this? Elena's voice broke through the tense silence. What's your goal? The man leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him as though savoring the moment. Power, Elena. Control. It's all about influence. Who has it, who doesn't, and who can make it bend to their will. What you've been uncovering is a network that extends into every corner of society. Politics, business, law enforcement. Everything is connected, and you've been too busy chasing the wrong leads to see the bigger picture. Kyla clenched her fists, but her mind was racing. This man wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was part of something much larger, and whoever he was working for, they had far-reaching power. So, what now? Kyla asked, her voice low but defiant. You think you've won? You think we're just going to walk away? The man chuckled darkly. No, Kyla. You've come this far, but you're out of your depth now. You'll never be able to stop it. You're up against an entire system, a web of influence so entrenched, it would take decades to untangle. And I'm the one holding the strings. The words stung, but Kyla's resolve didn't waver. She wasn't about to let him control her. What's the point of all this? Jamal asked, his voice tight. What do you gain from all of it? The man stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Kyla's. I gain the future. A future where I, and others like me, control the fate of millions. A future where the powerful stay powerful, and the rest of you remain in the dark, believing you can make a difference. The room seemed to close in on Kyla. She was up against a system that was built to crush anyone who dared challenge it. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. You're wrong, Kyla said, stepping forward, her voice steady. You might control the system, but it's flawed. There are cracks. And people like me, we're the ones who'll exploit them. For a moment, the man's expression faltered. He didn't expect her to challenge him. The brief flicker of doubt in his eyes was enough to confirm that he had underestimated her. People like you, he sneered. You think you're going to change anything? You're just one person, Kyla. One person can change everything, Kyla replied, her voice growing stronger. The system is rotten, and it will crumble. People are waking up to the truth, and they won't let people like you get away with it. The man's smile disappeared. He stepped toward her, his presence imposing. You have no idea what you're up against. Then show me, Kyla said, her voice steady, refusing to flinch. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Kyla thought he might make a move. But instead, he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit down, Kyla, he said, his tone shifting, now laced with an almost polite menace. Let's talk. Maybe we can make a deal. Kyla stiffened, but she didn't back down. Elena and Jamal stood guard, their hands on their weapons, but Kyla motioned for them to stay back. This wasn't a fight. Not yet, anyway. She needed information. She needed to understand just how deep this rabbit hole went. Why would I ever make a deal with you? Kyla asked, her gaze never leaving his. He smiled, that chilling, controlled smile. Because, Kyla, you're smart. You know that taking down a network like this isn't something you can do alone. You'll need resources, power, and you can't win without it. Kyla didn't move, but her mind was working overtime. She knew what he was offering. He was trying to make her an offer she couldn't refuse. An offer that would compromise everything she stood for. Who are you really working for? She asked, not letting him distract her. Who's pulling your strings? He leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied glint in his eyes. That's a question you'll never get the answer to. But let me make you an offer. Work with me, and you'll have access to everything. The resources, the power, the influence. You'll be untouchable. Kyla didn't hesitate. She stood up straight, her eyes hard. You've got the wrong person. I'd rather burn this whole system to the ground than be a part of it. The man's expression darkened, the smile fading as he looked at her with contempt. Then you're already lost. But you're wrong, Kyla said, her voice resolute. I'm not the one who's lost. The man's face twisted into an expression of disdain as Kyla turned her back on him. She wasn't backing down, not in the face of his threats or the overwhelming power he represented. The quiet hum of the city beyond the office window reminded her that the storm was just beginning, and if she had anything to say about it, she wasn't going to let him win. You think you've won this battle, the man sneered, his voice cold. You're a fool. You can't defeat me. You don't have the strength, the network, the connections. You're a lone wolf, Kyla, and you'll always be just that, alone. Kyla paused at the door, her fingers resting on the handle. His words were meant to provoke, to destabilize her, but they only fueled her resolve. The truth was, she was never really alone. She had her team, her allies, and the truth on her side. That was more powerful than any network of influence he could build. I'm not alone, she said without turning around, her voice steady. And I'll prove it. She stepped out of the office, leaving the man's hollow threats behind. Outside, Elena and Jamal fell in line behind her, their faces tense with anticipation. Are we really going to let him go? Elena asked quietly, her voice laced with frustration. For now, Kyla answered, her gaze unwavering. He's dangerous, but he's a piece of the puzzle. The bigger game's still ahead of us. We need to keep pushing, keep exposing the cracks in this system. Jamal nodded, though his expression showed just how high the stakes were now. What's the next move? We need to go public, Kyla said. But we need to be smart about it. We've gathered enough to take down his network, but we need more. We need evidence, the kind that can't be ignored. Elena's eyes narrowed. You're talking about the media? Exactly, Kyla said. We expose it all. His connections, his power, his control. People won't stay silent once they know the truth. We've seen it happen before. The system will collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Jamal spoke up. But we have to be careful. If we make the wrong move, it's over. He has the resources to destroy us. Kyla's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She knew the risks. They were walking a fine line, but the only way forward was to keep pushing. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Then we play it carefully, Kyla said, her voice firm. We'll go public, but we do it in a way that forces his hand. We make him expose himself. And when he does, we'll be ready. As they exited the building, the weight of what lay ahead settled over her. They were outnumbered and outmatched in ways they hadn't even begun to comprehend. But the more she learned about this man and the system he was a part of, the more determined she became. This was more than just a fight for justice. It was a fight for the future. They couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, plans, and careful maneuvering. Kyla knew that every step they took had to be precise, calculated. They were about to ignite a firestorm, and there would be no turning back once the world saw what was really happening. She spent hours reviewing every scrap of information they had gathered. Financial records, wiretaps, hidden connections that tied the man to every facet of the criminal underworld. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. They needed something more concrete, something irrefutable. Kyla's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Elena. We got something. It's big. Kyla's pulse quickened as she quickly dialed Elena's number. What did you find? Kyla asked, her voice urgent. Meet us at the safe house, Elena replied. This could be the break we've been waiting for. Within the hour, Kyla was standing in a nondescript apartment building, her heart pounding in her chest. Elena and Jamal were already inside, their faces grim as they gathered around a laptop. What's going on? Kyla asked, her eyes scanning the room. Elena gestured to the screen. We traced the money. It's bigger than we thought. This man, this system he's a part of, it goes straight to the top. We've got proof of political ties, business connections, even law enforcement officers on the payroll. Kyla leaned forward, studying the documents that flashed across the screen. Her mind raced as the implications hit her. This was it. The smoking gun. The evidence that could bring down the entire operation. Who's involved? She asked, her voice low, controlled. Elena clicked through a series of names and connections, her fingers flying across the keyboard. You won't believe this, Kyla, but it's not just some faceless bureaucrats. She paused, turning the screen toward Kyla. This is high level. Senators, CEOs, judges, even the media. Kyla's stomach churned as she took in the scale of it. The people in power, the ones who were supposed to protect and serve, were all in on it. And they were so deep, so entrenched, that pulling them out would be like pulling apart the very fabric of society. But this is our chance, Kyla said, her voice steady. We bring this to the people. We show them who's really pulling the strings. Jamal looked up from the screen, his eyes sharp. We have to be careful. The moment we release this, we become targets. Everyone involved will come after us. Kyla nodded, her mind already working through the next steps. We're not just going to release it. We're going to make sure they can't ignore it. We get the media involved. We push it to the top. We make sure everyone knows who's behind this. The days leading up to the release of the evidence were tense, every moment pregnant with danger. Kyla's team was ready, but they all knew the risks. This was the kind of fight that would leave no one untouched. On the eve of their final move, Kyla stood alone on a rooftop, looking out at the city below. It felt like the calm before the storm, and yet, she felt a sense of resolve deep within her. She wasn't afraid of what was coming. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions now. Tomorrow, everything would change. The storm would break, and there would be no going back. The next morning dawned with an eerie quiet. Kyla stood at the center of the command center, surrounded by her team, each of them poised and focused. It was time. The evidence they had meticulously collected, proof of corruption, illegal deals, and a network spanning the highest echelons of power, was about to be released to the world. Kyla glanced around at Elena, Jamal, and the others. Their faces were a mixture of determination and apprehension. There was no turning back now. "Are you sure about this?" Jamal asked quietly, his brow furrowed in concern. "Once we hit Sind, everything changes." Kyla nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. We have the truth, and it's time everyone saw it." Elena was already on the phone with a trusted journalist, preparing to leak the first round of documents to the media. The whole world would soon know the depth of corruption that ran through the veins of society's elite. It was the moment of reckoning. Kyla's phone buzzed. A text from an anonymous source. It was simple, just a few words. "You've gone too far. There's no escape now." Her stomach tightened, but she didn't flinch. She was ready for the fallout. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about exposing the system that had betrayed so many, the system that had hidden its filth beneath a veil of power and influence. "Get it done," Kyla said, her voice firm. "Send the files. Now." Elena nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard. In a matter of seconds, the world would know what Kyla had uncovered. The first document was sent, then the second, and the third. One by one, the files dropped into the hands of journalists, activists, and anyone who could help amplify their voices. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Kyla could feel her pulse quicken as the minutes ticked by. What would happen once the news broke? How would the powers that be react? Just as she was lost in thought, her phone rang. The number was unknown. Her hand trembled slightly as she answered. "This is Kyla," she said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "Kyla, it's me," a familiar voice said. It was Jamal. "Jamal, what's going on?" Kyla asked, her heart pounding. "Something's happening," he replied, his voice tight with urgency. "The story's already breaking. We're seeing reports on news stations, online. It's everywhere. The backlash is swift, but we've got something else too. There are people coming to your door. Big names, police, politicians, they're all showing up. They want to talk." Kyla felt her breath catch. She had anticipated backlash, but this was happening faster than she expected. The storm was here. It was overwhelming. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "Stay safe, Kyla," Jamal said. "We're on our way to you." Kyla hung up the phone, her mind racing. She had no illusions about what was coming. These were the people who controlled the narrative, the ones who could silence her with a single phone call or smear campaign. But she had already made her choice. The door to the room slammed open. Elena rushed in, her face pale. "Kyla, they know. They're coming for us. We need to move now." Kyla didn't hesitate. She knew it was time to leave. The evidence was out, and now they were officially on the radar. But what they hadn't expected was how quickly the tide would turn. The power structure that Kyla had threatened was already responding, swiftly, aggressively. As the team packed up and prepared to leave, Kyla paused for a moment, looking at the city skyline. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew that their fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. She had ignited something that couldn't be snuffed out. A knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. Kyla's heart raced as she turned to face the team. "Get ready. They're here." The storm had broken, and there was no telling what would be left in its wake. The hours that followed were a blur of chaos. Kyla and her team had barely escaped the building when law enforcement, under the direction of powerful figures whose names had now become all too familiar, descended upon their headquarters. It was a display of brute force, the kind of intimidation that had been used to silence dissenters for years. Kyla's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown contact. "You've made a powerful enemy. You can't win. They'll come for you." She didn't need to respond. She already knew the danger they were in, but she wasn't afraid. We can't back down, she told her team, her voice fierce. We push forward. We expose them even more. We have to make sure the world knows everything. Jamal clenched his fists. But we're outnumbered. They have the media, the power, the law. What's our move? Kyla took a deep breath, collecting herself. We fight back with what we have left, our voice. We keep pushing the truth. We use the media to our advantage. They can try to bury it, but we won't let them. Elena stepped forward, her eyes filled with resolve. We can't let them take us down, Kyla. Not now. Kyla nodded. We keep moving. We don't stop, no matter what. As they fled to their safe house, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The storm was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Kyla and her team were in hiding now, deep within the heart of the city. The safe house, an unassuming townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, felt like a fortress, but even here, the threat loomed large. Kyla could sense it in the air. A heaviness, a weight of impending consequence. The world they had stepped into had no rules, no limits. It was a world of shadows, where enemies lurked just out of sight, and the line between right and wrong had long since blurred. They had gone to ground, but it didn't matter. The leaks they had orchestrated, the carefully prepared documents and explosive testimonies, were spreading like wildfire. The press was picking up on every detail, and for the first time in years, there was real public outrage. People were waking up to the truth. The veil had been lifted, but that truth was dangerous. Too dangerous for those in power to ignore. Kyla stared at her laptop screen. The news was unfolding faster than she could process. She watched as one by one, the names of the powerful figures they had exposed began to make headlines. Lawmakers, corporate tycoons, even figures within the police force. These were the people who had orchestrated the corruption and manipulation, and now they were being dragged into the light. Yet as the evidence mounted, so did the retaliation. Already, Kyla had received multiple threats. They had tried to intimidate her with legal pressure, and even with direct threats to her safety. But it wasn't just her anymore. It was her team, too. And Kyla wasn't about to let them go down without a fight. We can't stay here much longer, Jamal said, breaking her thoughts. His face was grim. They're searching for us. Every place we've been to in the last few days is compromised. Kyla nodded. She had expected this. The people she had exposed weren't just going to back off. They would stop at nothing to erase her and her team. But she wasn't going to let that happen. I know, Kyla said, her voice quiet but resolute. But we have to make our next move count. We don't stop until the truth is everywhere. Elena sat at the table, her fingers flying over her phone as she made contact with the press. The coverage is intensifying. Some of the media is on our side. But the others, they're already trying to spin it, paint us as criminals, terrorists. We need to make sure we're one step ahead. Kyla turned to her team, her expression hardening. We've got one chance to make a real impact. We need to use everything we have. Every connection, every leak, every interview. We've built a network of allies, but now it's time to make our stand. We take this to the people. The phone rang. It was a video call from one of their most trusted journalists. Kyla answered quickly, her eyes scanning the face of the man who had been a key part of their media strategy. I've got news, the journalist said, his voice urgent. The story's blowing up, but there's something else you need to know. The powers that be are getting desperate. They're moving fast, trying to shut down the narrative. They're going after your team. You need to be ready for the worst. Kyla's pulse quickened. What do you mean by the worst? They're using everything. The legal system, public smear campaigns. And there's word of an impending raid on your safe house. If they find you, I'll be ready, Kyla cut in. We've got everything we need to fight back. The journalist hesitated. I believe in this story, Kyla, but you need to know, this could get dangerous. You're not just up against the corrupt. You're up against an entire system that's protecting them. Kyla looked at her team. Each of them locked in with the same unspoken understanding. This wasn't just a fight for truth anymore. It was a fight for survival. We don't have a choice, Kyla said, her voice low. We've come too far to back down now. Elena stood, ready for action. What's the plan? Kyla met her gaze. We're going to broadcast it all. We're going live." By the time they made their decision, the world had already shifted beneath their feet. Kyla knew the risks, but she also knew that their next move could expose the system completely. It was time to go public, not just with more evidence, but with a direct confrontation. They would be broadcasting live, right into the heart of the storm. The team had worked tirelessly to set up the infrastructure. They had a safe, encrypted channel that would reach millions. No one would be able to stop it. No one would be able to silence them. But as the hour approached, the tension in the room was palpable. Kyla stood in front of the makeshift studio they'd set up in their safe house, facing the camera that would soon broadcast their message to the world. "We're doing this for the people," she said, her voice steady but with a fire beneath it. "For everyone who's been wronged, silenced, and ignored. We're going to show the world the truth, whether they like it or not." Jamal checked the systems one last time. "We're ready. They won't know what hit them." Kyla nodded. This was their moment. She could already hear the sirens in the distance, signaling the closing in of their enemies. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the truth they were about to expose. The world would hear them, no matter what happened next. The countdown began. Kyla's fingers hovered above the keyboard, her breath steadying in preparation for the moment she knew could change everything. The room was silent, save for the hum of electronics and the occasional rustle of her team adjusting their positions. Elena gave a silent nod, signaling that they were ready. The screens before them flickered with images, documents, and faces of the powerful figures they had worked tirelessly to expose. Kyla felt a pang of doubt, but she quickly brushed it aside. This was their time. They had already been through too much to hesitate now. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "Go," Kyla said. The screen flashed live, and the world was watching. Kyla's face appeared on the screen, her eyes filled with resolve. Behind her, her team stood ready, their expressions fierce and determined. The broadcast began, and Kyla's voice rang out with the power of someone who had spent years uncovering the truth and was now about to share it with the world. "Good evening," Kyla began. "This is not just another report or another conspiracy. This is the truth, and I'm here to tell it, regardless of the consequences. For too long, we have been manipulated, lied to, and controlled by a system that is built on corruption, inequality, and greed." The camera zoomed in on her face as she continued. "Over the last few months, my team and I have gathered irrefutable evidence that exposes the highest levels of government, corporate elites, and law enforcement officials who have been complicit in a web of lies and deceit. Today, we reveal the truth, because we can no longer stand idly by." She clicked a button on the desk, and a new image filled the screen. A graphic of the names of powerful figures she had carefully documented. There was a moment of silence as the names appeared, each one a symbol of the system that had been protecting them for years. Here are the people who have been pulling the strings. These are the ones who thought they were untouchable. They've used their power to oppress, to silence, and to destroy lives. Kyla paused for a moment, allowing the gravity of the situation to sink in. Her heart pounded, but she stood firm. She was no longer just a journalist or a whistleblower. She was a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who had been ignored for far too long. "But we're not backing down," she said, her voice unwavering. "We've gathered the evidence, the testimonies, the leaks. And now, it's time for the world to see it. No more hiding. No more lies." Behind her, the team activated their screens, showing detailed evidence, documents, videos, and recordings that painted a damning picture. The names of officials flashed, followed by shocking footage of corrupt deals, cover-ups, and abuse of power. It was everything they had worked for, everything they had risked their lives for. And then, just as the broadcast reached its peak, a loud crash echoed from the back of the room. Kyla whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. A team of masked figures stormed in, guns drawn. They had made it. The people who would do anything to silence her were here. The safe house was compromised. But it was too late. The broadcast was live, and the world was watching. "Cut it off. Cut the feed," one of the intruders shouted. But it was already too late. The images of corruption were out there, splashed across every screen. Kyla's team moved swiftly, pushing the intruders back, but it was clear that they had only moments before the authorities would be upon them. The clock was ticking. "This is our fight," Kyla said, eyes burning with determination. "We're not going to let them erase everything we've built." Elena, ever the strategist, reached for the control panel. "The signal's out," she said, her voice sharp. "It's on every major network. They can't stop it now." Kyla gave a small, satisfied smile despite the danger. The truth was out. The system would never be the same. Outside, sirens blared, drawing closer, but in this moment, it no longer mattered. Kyla's team had done their job. They had exposed the corruption, and nothing, no matter how many threats, no matter how many guns, could change that. "Let them come," Kyla said quietly. "We've already won." And as the door to the safe house burst open, the reality set in. The battle was far from over, but the first shot had been fired. The world didn't wait. Within hours, the impact of Kyla's broadcast rippled across the globe. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, some amplifying the truth, others attempting to deflect it. But one thing was clear. The cat was out of the bag. There was no going back. Kyla and her team managed to escape the safe house, their carefully laid plans for extraction kicking into gear. They weren't safe yet. They knew the authorities, complicit or not, would come for them. But they also knew they had given the people a reason to fight. As they moved through the underground tunnels, Kyla's phone buzzed. It was a message from one of their sources inside the police department. "They're coming for you, Kyla," the message read. "But you've started something they can't stop. The people are waking up." Kyla glanced at her team, her eyes shining with resolve. "We'll keep fighting. We'll make sure the truth doesn't die." Days turned into weeks as Kyla and her team went into hiding, moving from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of the authorities and the powerful figures they had exposed. The world, however, had begun to change. People were angry. They were demanding answers, and they were rallying together in ways they hadn't before. Kyla's broadcast had lit a fire in the hearts of millions. As the pressure mounted, government officials scrambled to control the fallout, but the truth was already out there. Investigations were launched. Protests erupted across the country. The people's voices grew louder, demanding justice, and the corrupt system that had thrived in the shadows began to crumble. But Kyla knew this battle wasn't just about taking down a few bad actors. It was about dismantling an entire structure built on lies, greed, and oppression. The fight had only just begun. One night, Kyla stood on the rooftop of the building where she and her team had been hiding. She gazed out at the city below, the lights twinkling in the distance. The air was thick with the tension of change. In her hand, she held her phone, staring at a message that had just come through. "We've got them," it read. Kyla's heart skipped a beat. The key players, those responsible for the corruption, had been caught. The investigations had uncovered damning evidence, and it was only a matter of time before they would be brought to justice. The law enforcement agencies that had been complicit were now scrambling to distance themselves, but they couldn't hide the truth anymore. The system was unraveling, piece by piece. Kyla had done it. They had done it. As the first trials began, the world watched. The powerful figures who had once believed they were untouchable now found themselves facing the consequences of their actions. They were no longer behind closed doors, pulling strings in the shadows. The world knew who they were, and they could no longer escape the wrath of the people. Kyla watched from a distance, knowing her work wasn't done, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The world was changing, and she had played a part in that. Months later, Kyla stood in front of a crowded auditorium, her eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. It was a moment of reflection, of realization that the battle was not just hers, but everyone's. The people had spoken. The change was happening. She stepped up to the podium, cleared her throat, and began. "I stand before you today not as a hero, but as a witness to the power of truth, the power of the people, and the power of standing up when everything feels like it's stacked against you. We've won some battles, but the war isn't over. The work continues, and it's up to each and every one of us to ensure that the system is never allowed to fall into the hands of the corrupt again." There was silence in the room, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. I may have been the one to shine a light on the darkness, but it was all of you who made the difference. It was all of you who showed that change is possible. The crowd erupted in applause, but Kyla knew the applause wasn't for her. It was for the people, the fighters, the truth seekers. It was for the future they had all worked together to create. As Kyla stepped off the stage, she looked out at the faces in the crowd. She knew there would be challenges ahead. The fight for justice would never be easy. But she also knew that the world had shifted, and there was no going back. The truth had been unleashed, and nothing could silence it now.